The heat of the Pacific sun bore down like a merciless weight, pressing against the backs of men who shuffled forward with heads bowed. Their uniforms, once symbols of pride and discipline, hung in tatters, clinging to sweat-stained skin. These were soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, trained from youth to believe that surrender was worse than death, taught to expect merciless cruelty at the hands of their captors. Every step carried them deeper into the unknown, into a captivity their leaders had promised would be filled with torment, humiliation, and slow destruction. They did not march in silence. Inwardly, their minds wrestled with the grim pictures painted by propaganda. Images of Allied soldiers as monsters, tales of prisoners whipped, starved, and worked until they collapsed. They had been told their bodies would be used as experiments, their dignity stripped, their honor extinguished in cages far from home. For men raised to see death in battle as the only path of valor, survival now felt like betrayal, and the fate awaiting them seemed almost unbearable to imagine. The bitter taste of fear clung to their tongues, more suffocating than the dust that rose beneath their tired boots. The gates of the camp loomed ahead, tall wire fences topped with barbed metal, catching the light of the sinking sun. Behind them, shadows moved, indistinct but purposeful. The men braced themselves for jeers, for blows, for the first lash of suffering that would confirm everything they had been taught. The silence in that moment was suffocating, an oppressive stillness before a storm. Each man steeled himself, rehearsing courage in the face of expected brutality. And then, unexpectedly, came a sound none had anticipated. Not the crack of a whip, not the bark of a curse, but the steady hiss of running water. A strange mechanical rhythm echoed from within the camp, punctuated by bursts of steam rising into the evening air. It was the unmistakable sound of showers, modern, functioning, almost civilized. The smell of soap drifted faintly across the yard, mingling with the sweat and dust of men who had long resigned themselves to filth. The contradiction was almost unbearable. Was this the beginning of torture in disguise, or something else entirely? The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. What awaited them beyond those gates was not pain, but something far more unsettling. The collapse of certainty, the unraveling of a belief system that had guided them through war. The question now hung in the air like thunder on the horizon. If their captors were not monsters, then who were they? The story of Japanese prisoners of war during the Second World War is not simply a tale of captivity. It is a story of clashing worldviews, of deep-rooted expectations colliding with unexpected realities, and of how ideology shapes the very way human beings perceive their enemies. To understand why the sound of showers, rather than the crack of a whip, stunned Japanese soldiers, one must return to the atmosphere of the 1930s and 1940s, when Japan's empire stretched across Asia and the Pacific, and its soldiers marched with a certainty born from both pride and fear. For decades leading up to the war, Japan had fostered a culture rooted in the Bushido Code, the way of the warrior. Within this tradition, honor and loyalty were placed above life itself. To surrender was not merely defeat, it was shame, an act that stripped a soldier of his humanity. The state reinforced this belief through education, propaganda, and even family upbringing, so deeply ingrained that it guided the choices of millions. When war erupted across Asia, these ideas did not remain abstract. They became the lens through which every Japanese soldier viewed the battlefield and their enemy. That enemy, the Allied powers, were painted in lurid, terrifying tones. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts warned that Americans and British soldiers were barbaric, devoid of compassion, eager to humiliate and destroy. Tales spread of torture chambers, mutilations, and grotesque medical experiments awaiting any man who dared to surrender. For the ordinary infantryman, far from home and pressed into an unwinnable war, such stories were not only believable, They were inescapable. It meant that even in the face of hunger, wounds, and overwhelming force, many soldiers chose death rather than the imagined horrors of capture. But the reality awaiting them was shaped not by myth, but by law and necessity. The United States and its allies were bound, at least officially, by the Geneva Conventions, which prescribed standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. While not always perfectly observed, these rules called for humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, medical care, and sanitation. For nations committed to portraying themselves as champions of civilization, adherence to these rules also held political weight. To mistreat prisoners would not only invite accusations of hypocrisy, but risk retaliation against their own captured men. The geography of the conflict added another dimension. Across the Pacific, sprawling archipelagos and distant battlefields produced waves of captives as campaigns advanced. In places like Guadalcanal, Saipan, and the Philippines, Japanese forces, once confident in their superiority, found themselves isolated, cut off from supplies, and overwhelmed by superior Allied numbers. Men who had sworn never to surrender were captured in their thousands. They were marched to hastily established camps, their fates uncertain, their fears stoked by years of indoctrination. It was within these camps that the profound contradiction emerged. The Japanese, expecting cruelty, instead found showers, medical inspections, and organized barracks. They encountered routines of sanitation and hygiene that were both alien and disarming. In Japan, resources were scarce, and in the field, soldiers often endured lice, disease, and filth as unavoidable parts of war. Yet here, in enemy hands, they were ordered to bathe, to clean themselves, to enter a system designed not to degrade, but to maintain. For men conditioned to believe that surrender was the lowest state, this simple act of cleansing became a revelation and a humiliation. At the heart of this paradox lies the central question this documentary will explore. How does a soldier reconcile propaganda with reality? What happens when a worldview built on fear collapses under the weight of experience? And what do these moments of contradiction reveal about both the captor and the captive, about war itself, and about the enduring human struggle to understand one's enemy? This is not the story of a single camp, nor of a single group of men. It is the story of countless Japanese prisoners who stepped through the gates of captivity expecting to lose their humanity, only to confront an unsettling truth. Their captors treated them not as beasts to be broken, but as men to be managed, washed, and preserved. In this, the showers become more than plumbing fixtures. They become symbols of the clash between expectation and reality, between myth and truth, between the human instinct to fear the unknown and the equally human drive to impose order, even in war. The journey that follows will trace this tension from the moment of capture to the long months of captivity. It will uncover the fears carried into the camps, the shocks that greeted the prisoners, the contradictions that grew stronger with each passing week, and the transformative moments that forever altered their perception of both enemy and self. Above all, it will seek to understand what these experiences reveal about war, not as a matter of strategy or politics, but as a profoundly human confrontation with belief, deception, and the fragile possibility of compassion in the midst of violence. The Pacific War was a vast and brutal conflict, stretching across jungles, atolls, and seas. For the Japanese soldiers who found themselves taken prisoner, the road to captivity was paved with desperation, exhaustion, and the collapse of illusions carefully built by their leaders. To understand their expectations upon capture, one must first see the world they left behind on the battlefield and the ideas they carried into the cages of their enemies. In the early years of the war, Japanese troops were instilled with unshakable confidence. Their victories across Asia and the Pacific, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, the Philippines, seemed to confirm their superiority. Trained to see themselves as the heirs of a warrior tradition, they believed their empire's destiny was unstoppable. Yet, as the tide of war turned in 1942 and 1943, the once celebrated March of Conquest became a series of desperate retreats. At Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers fought in hunger and disease, their supply lines cut, their positions battered by relentless American firepower. At Saipan and Okinawa, entire divisions were obliterated in battles that consumed thousands of lives. In each of these moments, men were faced with choices their training told them never to make. For those captured, surrender did not come easily. Many were wounded or unconscious when taken. Others were starved to the brink of collapse. Some were surrounded, their ammunition spent, their officers dead. When capture came, it often arrived not as a choice, but as inevitability. Still, the shame of living weighed heavily upon them. For the Bushido ideal had taught that survival itself could be dishonor. As they stumbled into captivity, heads low and spirits fractured, they carried the burden of defeat, alongside the haunting stories they had been told of Allied cruelty. Japanese propaganda had long prepared them for horrors. Official leaflets described Americans as sadists who tortured captives for amusement. Radio broadcasts claimed prisoners were mutilated, their bodies used in grotesque experiments. In training camps back home, young recruits were warned never to allow themselves to fall into enemy hands, for the fate awaiting them would be worse than death. These images became imprinted in the minds of soldiers as undeniable truth. When the Allied forces closed in, fear of the enemy often exceeded fear of bullets. To surrender meant stepping into the role of a victim in a nightmare already scripted by their government. The first hours of captivity seemed to confirm their worst fears. They were herded together, weapons stripped away, forced into columns under the watchful gaze of armed guards. For men conditioned to think of Americans as brutes, even the firm commands of their captors carried a sense of menace. Every gesture, every silence, every motion of a rifle was magnified by imagination. They waited for blows that never came, for executions that never arrived. Suspense itself became a kind of torment. The march to the camps was long and grueling. Many prisoners were barefoot, their boots lost in battle. Their clothing, shredded by weeks in the field, offered little protection against the heat or cold, depending on the season and the landscape. Wounded men stumbled, supported by comrades, or collapsed entirely, expecting abandonment. Yet to their astonishment, some captors ordered medical attention or carried the wounded on makeshift stretchers. Suspicion gnawed at them. Was this genuine care, or some cruel trick designed to lure them into complacency? On arrival at the camps, the contradictions deepened. They expected barbed cages, chains, and cruelty. Instead, they saw barracks, simple, wooden, often crowded, but structured and orderly. They saw guards who enforced rules but did not whip them without cause. They saw fences and searchlights, but not the torture chambers they had envisioned. Still, fear did not vanish. The mind clings stubbornly to its fears, and for weeks, many prisoners convinced themselves the kindness was temporary, a mask hiding some darker fate yet to come. Their expectations were shaped not only by propaganda, but by the conditions of Japanese military life itself. In the Imperial Army, brutality was institutional. Recruits were beaten by their superiors for minor mistakes. Starvation diets and backbreaking labor were routine. Disease swept through units with little medical relief. In such an environment, cruelty was normalized, and discipline was synonymous with suffering. To these men, it seemed impossible that an enemy army would not treat captives even worse. The discovery that Allied discipline was firm but not sadistic came as a shock to their very sense of reality. Letters and diaries later revealed the depth of this fear. Some prisoners confessed their astonishment at being given food that was more nourishing than what they had received in the field. Others wrote of their disbelief at seeing captured comrades treated by doctors. One Japanese officer described his utter confusion at being ordered to bathe. for he had assumed sanitation was a luxury never afforded to captives. These early encounters with Allied routines, so ordinary to their captors, were nothing short of extraordinary to the men who had been told to expect barbarity. And yet, disbelief remained their constant companion. Many clung to the suspicion that torture would come later, perhaps after interrogation, perhaps when the guards grew tired of the charade. Their expectations of cruelty lingered like ghosts. Even when shown evidence of humane treatment, they struggled to accept it. For accepting it meant admitting that their empire's teachings had deceived them. That realization was as painful as any physical wound. Thus, the early days of captivity were not simply a passage into confinement, but an entry into a profound psychological struggle. On the one hand was the fear of torture, starvation, and death at the hands of the enemy. On the other was the bewildering discovery that their captors were not behaving as monsters. Between these poles, the prisoners lived in a suspended state, waiting for the blow that never fell, wondering if survival itself had become the greatest contradiction of all. The stage was now set for the first shocks that would dismantle their worldview. The showers, the food, the medical care, each would strike like lightning against the edifice of fear and expectation. But before transformation could begin, the prisoners had to endure those first haunting days when every kindness was mistrusted, and every silence seemed to hide a cruelty waiting to be revealed. The days that followed their arrival were a slow unraveling of expectations. For the Japanese prisoners of war, each moment inside the camp became a confrontation between what they had been taught and what they were now experiencing. They had braced themselves for whips, starvation, and humiliation. Instead, the first great shock came in the form of something deceptively ordinary: water. At first, the order to line up for showers filled them with dread. Rumors spread quickly among the men. This was the beginning of torture, or worse, execution disguised as sanitation. For many, the hiss of pipes and the smell of soap brought memories of stories they had heard about prisoners marched into chambers and gassed. Fear clutched their throats as they stripped, skin burning with the shame of exposure, convinced they were stepping into their final moments. And yet, as the streams of water poured over them, the reality was astonishingly different. Dirt and sweat, caked from weeks of combat and retreat, dissolved in rivulets down their skin, soap lathered between their fingers. The sensation was not pain but relief. For the first time in months, some felt clean. Their captors were not delivering poison but enforcing hygiene, an alien concept to soldiers accustomed to squalor in the field. The contradiction was overwhelming. Some wept silently under the flow of water, caught between shame, relief, and disbelief. The showers were only the beginning. The next shock came with food. Their expectations had been shaped by the harshness of their own military. Rations that dwindled into handfuls of rice, meals stretched by weeds and scraps, stomachs gnawed by hunger. They assumed Allied captivity would mean even worse: deliberate starvation to weaken them, thin gruel unfit for human consumption. Instead, they were handed trays of food. Bread, potatoes, vegetables, even meat appeared in portions larger than what many had eaten on campaign. Some prisoners refused at first, suspecting poison or trickery. Others devoured the meals with desperation, unable to resist their hunger. For weeks, suspicion lingered. Some men hid food, certain that the apparent abundance would soon give way to famine. Others waited for the cruelty to reveal itself, expecting the meals to be replaced by scraps once the captors grew tired of the performance. Yet as days turned to weeks, the pattern remained consistent. 3 meals a day, served at regular times, became the rhythm of captivity. The shock of nourishment, after years of propaganda promising torment, struck deeply at their beliefs. Medical care was perhaps the most disorienting contradiction of all. Japanese soldiers were taught that to fall wounded was to be left behind. In the Imperial Army, Doctors were few, supplies scarce, and wounded men often abandoned as burdens. Disease was rampant and hygiene almost non-existent. In captivity, however, Allied doctors inspected prisoners, dressed their wounds, and treated illnesses. Men who expected to be discarded instead found themselves examined with professional care. One soldier, later recalling his astonishment, wrote that he could not believe an enemy would treat his fever when his own officers had considered him expendable. The barracks themselves also unsettled expectations. Crowded, yes, and surrounded by wire, but organized and sanitary compared to the filth of jungle encampments. Prisoners were assigned bunks, blankets, and regular roll calls. Latrines, though primitive, were maintained with strict rules of cleanliness. At first, this order felt suffocating, another form of control. But gradually, men recognized that discipline in the camp was not designed to break them, but to preserve them. The realization was jarring. Their captors, whom they expected to kill them slowly, were determined instead to keep them alive. Personal anecdotes preserved in diaries and later interviews captured the emotional whiplash of these discoveries. One prisoner described his terror when the guards shouted for him to step forward, convinced he was about to be beaten. Instead, he was handed soap and instructed to wash. Another wrote of his shock when a medic changed the bandage on his leg wound and spoke to him without anger. A third recounted the taste of bread, soft, alien, and strangely comforting, after years of nothing but rice. These moments, mundane in peacetime, became transformative in the shadow of war. Yet not all shocks were welcome. For many, kindness itself was a source of pain. If the enemy was capable of humanity, then what did that say about the propaganda they had believed? If surrender was not the descent into hell they had been taught, then what of the comrades who had killed themselves rather than be taken? Guilt gnawed at them, a silent torment that no shower or meal could wash away. The contradiction between survival and honor deepened, and for some, the weight of shame became unbearable. At night, inside the barracks, whispers filled the air. Some prisoners admitted their confusion, questioning why the Americans would feed and clothe them. Others clung to suspicion, warning that the true cruelty was still to come. Arguments broke out between those who dared to believe in the evidence before them and those who clung to the safety of fear. The uncertainty itself was corrosive, tearing at the fragile sense of self each man carried into captivity. The first shocks were not only physical, but psychological. To be ordered to bathe, to be given clean clothes, to be treated as human. These acts dismantled more than grime and hunger. They chipped away at the foundation of belief instilled by years of indoctrination. Each act of ordinary civility became a hammer blow against the edifice of fear. And yet, paradoxically, it also deepened the prisoners' inner turmoil. To survive in captivity meant acknowledging that they had been deceived, that their empire had lied. For men raised in absolute loyalty, this was a betrayal too large to confront openly. The section of their journey through these shocks ended not with resolution, but with questions. If the showers were real, if the food was genuine, if the care was sincere, then what else might be false? Was their image of the enemy entirely wrong? Or was this a temporary illusion, a veneer that would crack under the pressure of time? The answers were not yet clear, and the men lived suspended in the space between disbelief and reluctant acceptance. The first shocks of captivity, so ordinary in the eyes of their captors, had become earthquakes in the lives of the prisoners. Clean water, nourishing food, medical attention, each was a revelation, each a reminder that their fears did not match their reality. But the contradictions had only begun. What awaited them in the months to come would press even harder against their expectations, forcing them to reconsider not only the nature of their captors, but the very meaning of survival. In the weeks and months that followed, the contradictions of captivity only deepened. The Japanese prisoners of war had entered the camps expecting to be broken, humiliated, or destroyed. Instead, they found routines of order, cleanliness, and discipline. At first, these shocks had unsettled them, but over time they gave way to a broader discovery. Captivity was not chaos, but a system. Within that system, the very things they feared most, starvation, torture, abandonment, gave way to nourishment, regulation, and, perhaps most disturbingly, fragments of humanity. The daily routine became both a source of relief and unease. Wake-up calls, roll calls, work details, meals, and lights out followed a steady rhythm. In the rigid order of camp life, prisoners began to measure their days not by fear of death, but by the ordinary markers of time. Yet this very normalcy gnawed at them. How could the enemy, painted as savage and monstrous, enforce routines that resembled military order, even care? Work details presented another contradiction. Prisoners were assigned tasks, clearing debris, repairing roads, tending gardens, or assisting in maintenance. They had expected forced labor designed to crush them, work so grueling that it would kill them slowly. Instead, the tasks, while tiring, were measured and purposeful. They were not driven with whips or beaten into compliance. Guards watched closely, but discipline came through commands, not cruelty. For men used to the harsh discipline of their own officers, the absence of violence was bewildering. Some even admitted in private reflections that the work was lighter than what they had endured under Japanese command. Entertainment and education were perhaps the most jarring discoveries of all. In some camps, prisoners were permitted to read books, play games, or even attend lectures organized by their captors. Music drifted across the compounds, American songs, sometimes even classical pieces played on gramophones. To men conditioned to think of their enemy as uncivilized beasts, the sound of violins or pianos was incomprehensible. Was this the cruelty they had been warned of? To be confronted not with barbarism, but with culture? Letters home, when permitted, further destabilized their worldview. Allowed to write brief notes to their families, prisoners faced an agonizing contradiction. They wanted to reassure loved ones of their survival, but how could they describe the reality of captivity? To admit they were treated with food, showers, and even medical care would expose the lies of the propaganda machine that had shaped their nation. Yet to deny these truths felt equally impossible. Some chose silence, others wrote cautiously, and still others avoided the subject altogether. The act of writing itself, being granted paper, ink, and the right to communicate, stood as another affront to their expectations. Interactions with guards created still deeper dilemmas. At first, they had seen their captors as faceless enemies, but in the rhythm of daily life, individuals emerged. A guard who returned a dropped item, a medic who treated a wound gently, a cook who offered an extra ladle of soup. These gestures, small but undeniable, chipped away at the image of the inhuman foe. The prisoners were left to wrestle with the unbearable question: if the enemy was capable of kindness, what did that mean for the righteousness of their own cause? This escalation of contradictions stirred profound inner conflict. Some men clung desperately to the propaganda of their homeland, insisting that the enemy's humanity was a facade. "It is a trick," they whispered at night, "a mask hiding their true cruelty." Others, quietly but inexorably, began to question. If everything they had been told about the Americans was false, what else had been a lie? Could it be that their empire had sacrificed them to myths while withholding the truth? For many, this psychological turmoil was more punishing than the physical conditions of captivity. To admit deception was to confront betrayal, not only by their leaders, but by the very values they had internalized since childhood. Men who had believed death preferable to surrender now had to live with the realization that survival did not equal dishonor, at least not in the eyes of their captors. The code of Bushido clashed with the reality of daily bread and warm water. Yet contradictions were not only about kindness. Discipline was strict, and transgressions brought consequences. Escape attempts were met with severe punishment, though rarely the brutality the prisoners had imagined. Infractions, fights, theft, defiance were addressed firmly, often with confinement or reductions in privilege. These measures reinforced the sense that the captors viewed them not as beasts, but as men bound by order, subject to rules rather than cruelty. The paradox only deepened. The Americans demanded obedience but not servitude, compliance but not degradation. Over time, the prisoners could not help but compare their experiences to the treatment they had once endured at the hands of their own officers. In the Japanese army, discipline was brutal. Beatings were common, food scarce, and medical neglect the norm. The realization that their captors enforced a system less cruel than their own comrades was unbearable. One man later confessed that this comparison haunted him more than any physical hardship of captivity. To survive under the enemy and find that life was in some ways less brutal than under one's own command was a humiliation greater than defeat. These contradictions reached beyond the walls of the camp. Prisoners knew that back home, their families believed them either dead or enduring unspeakable horrors. They imagined their loved ones grieving, convinced they had perished honorably in battle. The reality that they lived, washed, ate, and worked under humane conditions was a secret too painful to share openly. This silence became its own kind of torment, a contradiction that stretched across oceans, binding them in guilt and shame. Some prisoners began to adapt, finding small comforts in routine. They learned English words, discovered new foods, even laughed at moments of levity inside the camp. These fragments of normalcy clashed violently with their sense of dishonor, creating lives lived in constant tension. Survival was both blessing and curse, a contradiction embodied in every breath. The escalation of these contradictions did not lead immediately to acceptance or transformation. Instead, it created a battlefield within the mind, where fear, shame, relief, and disbelief clashed daily. For some, the psychological burden became too heavy, and despair overtook them. For others, a quiet shift began, a slow recognition that the enemy was not the monster they had been told, but men, flawed, stern, and at times even compassionate. The contradictions of captivity, work that was lighter than their own armies, discipline without brutality, food instead of starvation, showers instead of torture, had become too great to ignore. Yet the prisoners still wondered, was this all temporary? Would the mask of civility one day drop, revealing the horrors they had long feared? It was this uncertainty, this living on the edge between disbelief and reluctant recognition, that set the stage for the climax of their experience. The final collapse of propaganda, the undeniable transformation of perception, would not come through routine alone. It would come in moments of crisis, when survival itself demanded that they confront the full truth of what captivity had become. The months of captivity built slowly, like a tightening coil. The contradictions that had unsettled the Japanese prisoners of war from the first day inside Allied camps did not fade with time. They grew heavier, pressing on every assumption they had once carried. Yet, it was not until a series of decisive moments, small crises and larger turning points, that these contradictions finally reached their climax. It was here the transformation began, in the reluctant recognition that the enemy was not the monster of propaganda, but something far more complicated, a mirror of humanity itself. The turning point often came with illness. For many prisoners, the body had been pushed to the limits during battle, wounds left untreated, infections festering, hunger gnawing at every muscle. In the Imperial Army, a sick man was a burden, an obstacle to victory, and often left behind. To collapse in the field was to invite abandonment. In captivity, however, the opposite was true. When fever struck, Allied doctors came with thermometers and medicine. When wounds reopened, bandages were changed, even stitches applied. The act of being cared for by an enemy whose cruelty had been preached as certain was, for many, the final breaking point of their old beliefs. Survival itself became inseparable from this recognition. The enemy was not killing them, but keeping them alive. One prisoner, later interviewed after the war, recalled the moment of revelation when his infection was treated with penicillin, a drug unavailable to most Japanese soldiers in the field. "I believed I would die with shame," he confessed, "but instead, I lived because of them. It was then I knew our leaders had lied." For him, and for many others, the climax was not a single dramatic gesture, but the steady, undeniable reality that their captors valued their survival. Work details, too, took on new meaning. What began as suspicion that labor would be a tool of cruelty shifted into recognition that tasks were measured, purposeful, and far less brutal than what their own army had once demanded. Prisoners who built roads or tended gardens realized they were contributing to a system designed not to destroy, but to sustain. Some even found pride in their work, discovering a rhythm that dulled the sharp edge of captivity. The recognition was painful, but transformative. The enemy did not seek to strip them of dignity, but to manage them as part of an ordered, almost bureaucratic vision of war. Yet the most dramatic transformations came through direct human contact. Prisoners who expected hatred were confounded by moments of compassion. A guard who returned a dropped photograph of a family, a medic who spoke kindly during treatment, even an officer who offered cigarettes or small privileges. These gestures shattered the myth of inhumanity. To receive kindness from a supposed monster forced the prisoners to question not only their propaganda, but the very nature of honor and loyalty. The climax of this transformation was not uniform. For some, it came in a single moment of revelation. For others, it was a gradual erosion of certainty. But for nearly all, there came a point when the scales tipped, when the evidence of lived experience outweighed the weight of indoctrination. To admit that their enemy was human, even civilized, was to confront the betrayal of their own leaders. It was also to face the unbearable guilt of comrades who had died clinging to the belief that capture was worse than death. This guilt was perhaps the sharpest edge of transformation. In the barracks, men whispered the names of comrades who had chosen suicide over surrender, men who leapt from cliffs at Saipan, who charged into hopeless battles, who pulled grenades against their chests rather than be taken. Those sacrifices, once seen as noble, now seemed built on lies. The prisoners lived on, washed and fed, their wounds treated, their lives preserved. In surviving, they carried not only their own shame, but the knowledge that their comrades had died for an illusion. This recognition transformed captivity from mere survival into a profound reckoning with truth. Some responded with despair, withdrawing into silence. Others embraced adaptation, learning English, engaging with routines, even forming bonds with their captors. A few began to imagine a world after the war, one in which the humanity of the enemy might reshape their own understanding of honor. These transformations were not celebrated. They were quiet, private, often hidden from others. To openly admit such thoughts risked accusations of weakness from fellow prisoners still clinging to the old beliefs. But beneath the surface, the shift was undeniable. The climax was also embodied in liberation itself. When the war drew to its end in 1945, many prisoners expected that release would be marked by humiliation, or that their captors would finally reveal the cruelty they had hidden. Instead, liberation came with a strange gentleness. Allied officials processed them, recorded their names, and prepared them for repatriation. Instead of degradation, they were met with order, efficiency, and even a measure of dignity. The moment of stepping beyond the barbed wire for the last. Time was filled not with triumph, but with the haunting recognition that captivity had destroyed not their bodies, but their illusions. In interviews conducted after the war, some Japanese prisoners admitted that their transformation was profound. They had entered the camps expecting torture and humiliation, but had found showers, food, medicine, and order. The collapse of propaganda was complete. Yet the transformation did not end with recognition of the enemy's humanity. It also reshaped their understanding of their own society. They saw in their captors' treatment of prisoners a reflection of values their own army had denied them. They saw that survival could coexist with dignity, that discipline need not mean cruelty, that compassion could exist even in war. The climax of their captivity then was not a single dramatic event, but a series of moments in which belief crumbled and reality emerged. The showers, the food, the medical care, these were not just amenities of captivity, but instruments of transformation. By the time liberation came, the prisoners were no longer simply defeated soldiers. They were men who had been forced to confront the collapse of myth, the betrayal of propaganda, and the unsettling truth of survival. This transformation did not erase the shame of surrender, nor did it heal the wounds of war, but it did leave an indelible mark on those who experienced it. For some, it became the foundation for new perspectives after the war, influencing how they viewed both Japan's role in the conflict and their own place within it. For others, it remained a wound, a silent burden carried to the end of their days. But for all, the climax of captivity was the moment when torture gave way to showers, when fear gave way to survival, and when myth collapsed under the weight of lived experience. When the war ended in 1945 and the gates of captivity opened, the Japanese prisoners of war stepped out into a world forever altered. They had entered Allied camps burdened with terror, convinced that survival would mean degradation, torture, or death. Instead, they had lived through months, sometimes years, of nourishment, cleanliness, and order. The experience did not erase the pain of defeat, nor the deep shame of surrender, but it left behind something far more enduring: the collapse of propaganda and the revelation of an unsettling truth. For many, repatriation was not a triumphant return home, but a continuation of their inner struggle. On ships carrying them back across the Pacific, the men looked to the horizon with unease. They feared how their families and communities would receive them. In Japan, surrender was still seen as dishonor, and captivity, even humane captivity, was viewed as disgrace. Some prisoners concealed their experiences, speaking little of the showers, the food, or the unexpected compassion. Others dared to share their stories, only to find disbelief or resentment among their countrymen. The contradiction followed them home. They had survived, but survival itself was suspect. And yet, privately, many could not forget what they had witnessed. They remembered the first rush of water in the showers, the taste of bread after weeks of hunger, the quiet efficiency of doctors who treated their wounds. They remembered guards who, instead of cruelty, enforced discipline with fairness, and the strange normalcy of routines that mirrored their own army's order but stripped away its brutality. These memories haunted them, but also reshaped them. For the rest of their lives, they carried the knowledge that the enemy had not been what they had been told. This realization did more than shatter personal illusions. It contributed in small but significant ways to the reshaping of Japan's understanding of the war itself. In the years that followed defeat, as the nation rebuilt under Allied occupation, stories of prisoners' experiences slowly emerged. Though often muted by shame, they revealed that the empire's narratives of cruelty had been lies, and that survival had been possible without dishonor. For a society grappling with the devastation of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and unconditional surrender, these accounts were threads in a larger tapestry of reckoning. The contrast between expectation and reality also highlighted broader lessons about war. It revealed how propaganda functions not only to demonize the enemy, but to control one's own soldiers, pushing them toward sacrifice in the name of myths. It showed how ideology can strip men of choice, convincing them that death is preferable to a survival that might reveal inconvenient truths. And it demonstrated that even in the brutality of global conflict, humanity could persist, not as sentimentality, but as structure, law, and order enforced by those who recognized the value of maintaining dignity, even in the defeated. The showers themselves became enduring symbols. For Allied soldiers, they were a matter of routine, a simple act of hygiene to preserve health in crowded camps. For the Japanese prisoners, they were moments of revelation. They entered with dread, convinced they would face torture or execution, and emerged clean, astonished, and confused. The hiss of water, the sting of soap, the feeling of dirt washed away. These became metaphors for the collapse of lies and the possibility of renewal. In the quiet of those moments, men confronted the difference between belief and reality, between what they had been taught and what they had experienced. Not all lessons were comforting. The recognition of the enemy's humanity did not absolve the war's horrors. Many prisoners, even as they acknowledged their captors' fairness, remained haunted by the suffering inflicted by Allied bombs, by the destruction of their homes, by the deaths of comrades. Compassion in captivity did not erase devastation in battle. Yet the coexistence of both truths, the cruelty of war and the humanity of captivity, was itself a profound revelation. It showed that even in the darkest times, complexity endured, defying the simplicity of propaganda. The legacy of these experiences extended far beyond the individual prisoners. They became part of the larger story of how nations remember war. For Japan, the accounts of humane treatment in captivity contributed to the painful recognition that its leaders had deceived the population. For the United States and its allies, they stood as evidence of adherence to international law, a demonstration of civilization in contrast to the atrocities committed elsewhere. The showers, the food, the order of the camps became symbolic proof that even in victory, restraint was possible. And yet, perhaps the most enduring impact was personal. For the men who had once feared only torture, captivity became a crucible of transformation. Some left their camps with bitterness, unable to reconcile shame with survival. Others carried forward a quiet gratitude, a recognition that their lives had been preserved not by their own empire, but by their enemies. A few went further still, dedicating their post-war years to bridging divides, to fostering understanding between Japan and the nations they had once fought. Their transformations became seeds of reconciliation, small acts of humanity born from the most unexpected of places. The story of Japanese prisoners who expected torture, but instead found modern showers, is not, at its heart, about plumbing or hygiene. It is about the collision between belief and reality, about the power of propaganda to shape fear, and about the resilience of truth to emerge even in captivity. It is about men who carried into the camps the weight of a culture that glorified death, and who walked out having discovered, however painfully, that survival could reveal a different kind of honor, one rooted not in myth, but in the simple recognition of shared humanity. As the decades passed, memories of the war faded, but these stories endured in diaries, testimonies, and the quiet recollections of aging veterans. They remind us that history is not only written in battles and treaties, but in the lived experiences of individuals who confronted the unexpected. They remind us that propaganda can deceive, that fear can blind, but that truth, when encountered directly, has the power to transform. And they remind us, above all, of the fragility of humanity in war, that a shower, an act so ordinary in peacetime, could become a moment of revelation speaks to the depths of fear and the heights of surprise that defined captivity. It speaks to the enduring question of what it means to be human in a world torn by conflict. As the narrator's voice fades, one question remains, suspended across time. What do we learn when the enemy we have been taught to hate reveals themselves not as a monster, but as a mirror.